Hey guys, and welcome back. My name is James, and today we'll be making this everyday carry card holder. Now you'll notice it's a bit bigger than usual card holders and only works on one side. It's not foldable. The reason behind this was that I needed something in which I could store my French identity card. Now French ID cards are slightly bigger than regular size cards and they're plastified, so you can't really fold them, and they're impractical and won't fit in most wallets or any small everyday carry card holder. So I designed something a bit bigger that could take my French identity card as well as have two card slots for my other stuff basically that I'd have every day. So credit cards, usual cards, as well as maybe some notes or anything I might need to store in here can fit in here. You can find the link to the pattern in the description down below underneath this video. And yeah, hopefully guys, you'll enjoy watching me build this. Hopefully you'll try it out for yourself as well. And hopefully you'll enjoy this video. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you're printing out the template 100% scale. Most printers like to downscale very slightly when they're printing out pictures like this, PDF files, or they'll have their own sort of magic thing that happens, but make sure that you go into your printer settings when you're printing this out and click 100% scale for printing. The tolerances on these patterns are actually quite tight, so if you're not at the same scale, you may find you have issues later on down the road. However, again, if you also find that you want to change the size very slightly, you can go back into those printer settings and print slightly bigger or slightly smaller, whatever you guys prefer. The PDF files are made so you have a bit of leeway, so that should be absolutely fine. For cutting it out, I'm using regular paper, and I'm actually using a really nice little scalpel here to get the first cutout ready. I would recommend, if you want to use this template a few times or want to make the next bit of the process easier, to stick it on some cardstock to give you a bit more material to play with. I'm using 1.2mm vegetable tanned leather. It is a bit dry to start off with, so I am going to go ahead and oil it here, but even if it hadn't been that dry, I probably would have anyway, simply because my next few steps are going to really dry it out even further. Now, depending on the leather you're using, you may or may not want to skip this part, but I'm going to be using ethanol, which is basically just alcohol, and I'll be mixing it 50-50 with some Skiving's professional oil dye in dark brown. The reason I'm doing this is to enable me to have much better control over my dyeing process. I'm still learning it a lot as I go with dyes, and as I mentioned, you may want to skip this part if you're not intending to dye your leather, but in this case I went ahead and did it. Now, you have to know that dyeing leather will dry it out. Now, most dyes will be alcohol based. You can get water-based ones, but the ones that work best are the alcohol-based ones. The issue with alcohol is that it tends to dry out your leather. Now, the more you dye, obviously, the drier your leather gets. So by mixing this up, it does mean that I have more control over my dyes, because I can more gradually find the color that I want. But it also means that potentially I am drying out this leather much more than planned, which is why I used the oil in the first step and why I probably use oil at this step. But instead, I went straight to Saphir Renovateur instead of using Neatwood oil. There are several reasons why I want to use this. First of all, it's a Renovateur cream. It brings back a lot of those oils back into the leather and makes sure that your leather is all supple and nourished. But secondly, it will also add a small coat of wax that the Neatwood oil does not contain, that will help buff and protect, or that will look good when it's buffed, but will help protect the leather during the next few phases of the build process. Here's the final result, a nice classic dark brown color on leather, which I always find very appealing and very pleasing. It's got a few problems, this leather. It's not a gorgeous leather, it's a good piece of leather, but it does have some blemishes, but that isn't really a problem for me. Go ahead and trace out your pattern, and also trace out your pattern on the lining. I'm using an old tote bag that a company gave me some time back, because I find that the tote bag quality or the lining, or it makes for really nice lining basically. So don't worry too much if you notice the lining is smaller than your back piece. It's actually totally normal and planned, so don't worry about that. Go ahead and cut it anyway. The lining has to be smaller, and we'll talk more about that later. Before any major build, I love to take care of my tools. One big common misconception is thinking that a sharp tool is more dangerous. Well, to someone who doesn't know how to use tools, maybe. But if you're working seriously with your tools, a sharp tool is actually less dangerous because you need to apply less pressure. And then when you do slip, if you slip, you'll be able to control the slip much more and there are less chances of you hurting yourself. So always go ahead and keep your tools nice and sharp. Cut out this center piece and go ahead and use some sandpaper to roughen out or to even out those corners because they can be very tricky to do. You might want to use a round punch to punch the corners first, but in this case I went ahead and used my Indispensable by Verger Blanchard, which is the knife that you can see on the right hand side right there, which is a really cool little knife, very useful, very versatile. I do find the blade gets very dull quickly, but that's a completely different story. Once you're satisfied with your cutout, go ahead and bevel the edges. Now, I am using a Barry King's edge beveler, which is gorgeous. It's like their smallest one, I think, and it's really perfect for this kind of small goods, leather goods. It's brilliant for this use. But don't worry if you're starting out and you don't have one. You can use sandpaper instead. Just be very slow and careful with the process because you don't want to nick the leather while you're at it. You don't want to scratch up your leather with the sandpaper by mistake. So just be very slow and cautious when you're doing this with sandpaper. But hey, if you don't have the tools in leathercraft, guess what? You can probably get by just as fine with a bit of imagination and a bit of creativity. Most of us did at first when we started out. Tools is something that you gradually get to own as you grow in the craft. I don't know how to say that more specifically than that, but it's something that you appreciate discovering as you go. But at first I started off using a lot of sandpaper to do these edges to get them really nice, and it works perfectly fine. So don't worry if you don't have the really fancy edge beveler, go ahead and sand anyway. I will be burnishing those edges, but before I do that, I want to prep my lining and my back piece simply because this glue needs a bit of time to dry before it can be applied. So I want to prep this with the glue and let it dry on one side while I'm doing something else. Bear in mind that different glues work differently, and you'll want to test your, well, first of all, you'll want to check what's written on your package of the glue, but also test it out to see how it works for you, and find your method before starting to use that specific glue for your different builds. In my case, I want to leave it until it becomes a bit tacky. It's quite common with cement-based glues like this one, and this enables me to go and do some more stuff while it's drying. I am using Tokonol as my burnishing agent. You can use gum trag, or you can use quite a few different tips. There are quite a few different things you can use to do this. So I'm using Tokonol, which I find to be the absolute best for this, but feel free to use whatever burnishing agent you want. You did see me also burnish the inside of the piece, and that is to basically hold the fibers together. There is nothing worse than having a finished piece, and after a few weeks or months of use, your fibers on the inside start popping out, and your edges, even though they're burnished, don't look as good as they could. So go ahead and use the Tokonol to give the inside a slight burnish. This will help solidify those fibers so that they don't move and give you a much more professional look and feel to the final finish. Mark out where your card slots are going to be placed on the back panel, the front panel, and go ahead and, if you want to, this is optional, skive down here all around the sides. Now this will do two things. The first thing is that it will reduce the amount of material on the actual leather, and can be very crucial if you've got more than 3 pieces stuck together, but in my case, it's really basically for the second reason that I'm doing this, which is that it gives your glue a proper place to bond to the leather. If you're gluing straight on the top grain of a piece of leather like this one, it's been waxed, it's been oiled, your glue is going to have a tough time grabbing onto any fibers and sticking. Whereas here, because I've skived, the glue will have no problems whatsoever grabbing onto those fibers, and it will give them a much better base to work with. At this point, you can go ahead and glue the lining to the back panel. Now you'll notice that the lining is slightly smaller again than the back panel, and that is to accommodate the glue all around the piece. You do not want your lining to get between the 2 pieces of leather at the points that you are going to burnish. So you want to make sure that you're leaving enough space all around to be able to accommodate for this. Now don't worry, don't fret, the pattern is made so that you will have that space built in. The lining pattern is slightly smaller than the back panel pattern. So in theory, you'll have more than enough space for that. But if you're doing it with by eye, or have, like me, or had a piece of material that was slightly too close to the edge, just feel free to cut it away. No one will be able to see that later. go ahead and stick the card panel to the front panel and mark out where your stitching grooves are going to be. Now you can see that with the template provided, you've got that indication directly there. So I'm just using my pricking irons here to mark out where I'll be doing this before punching through my holes. I'm using Crimson Hide's pricking irons. I believe they're the Japanese style in 4mm spacing. And I'm using Maisie waxed M60 brown thread. And yes, I did go ahead and wax it a second time. I know it's already been waxed theoretically, but I love to give it a second waxing just because it helps make the wires or the threads just a bit harder, a bit tougher, which means they're not necessarily flying around all over the place. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it just feels good. If you haven't tried waxing or re-waxing threads before doing this, give it a try. Give it a try with some beeswax, as you can see here. It really does make a difference when sewing, and I find it helps not just keep the threads strong and protected, but also helps me in my sewing process. We are getting ready, guys, to see this whole thing come together, but before that we have to stick it back, stick the front to the back. As mentioned, that spacing left between the lining and the back will help you or enable you have some more space for the glue, and this will help you be able to then all glue it together. Make sure you align everything really nicely. And so if you go back to the beginning, cutting out your template, then scribing the template, then cutting out your leather, those are 3 steps where you have to be very, very careful to respect the actual pattern. Because if you don't, once you go and glue it up, your edges may not be as even as you'd want. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because my top edge was not perfect, and I put it down to my poor scribing and cutting ability or talent, and any issues you'll see appear along the edges here will be things that will take you a long time to correct later with sanding. In my case, I did end up having to sand a lot, and all I can say is just be very, very cautious when you're scribing, when you're cutting, just to make sure that all the edges are as neat and as close to true and accurate as possible, because otherwise you get to do all this sanding. And now I've sped this up, and not only have I sped this up, but I've also just shown basically just one corner here being sanded, but it took me a long time to try and correct these issues, and I'm not totally satisfied with the top part of my piece, but hey, you know what? It works fine, so I'm not going to go on about it too much. It works fine. Just be careful for you guys when you're doing it. Just make sure you're very regular in your cuts and scribes. Once you've sanded down all the corners to make sure that the different layers of leather are at the same, come to the same edge, basically make it form a nice clean edge, you can go ahead and bevel all around the piece. Now again, beveling and then dyeing and then burnishing is just, these are the steps basically to getting a really nice looking finished product. You could leave it raw if you wanted to, but I would definitely recommend getting good at these steps because this makes a huge amount of difference to the final piece. The quality will just speak for itself if you take the time and the patience to do it. Now, depending if you're making a bunch of these and have to go fast, you may want to skip some of these steps, but this is it for me. So I will sand, I will bevel, I will dye, I will add my token on, I will burnish, and then I will sand, I will dye. Yes, I do repeat it, guys. Now, if you're new to the craft and wondering why am I sanding down a perfectly good burnished edge, well, I will invite you all to go out and try it for yourself. The trick to achieving a perfect burnished edge is very simple. It's to do it over and over and over and over again. Indeed, the first burnish will never be perfect, so go ahead and sand it slightly, not too much, just very light sand all along the surface of that edge, and reapply basically. Do it again, and then sand it again, and do it again. Now, generally, two of these passes will be sufficient, but in this case, I had to go ahead and do it, I believe, 3 or 4 times on each side, simply because I just wasn't happy with the way it was looking, and I was looking to get it even better. So yeah, it can take a long time, but trust me guys, the time and effort you put into it definitely pays off. Scribe your lines 3 millimeters from the edge, guys. This is what is marked in the template, and this is how this whole thing is made. If you don't respect that, you may find it's a bit tight for you. So 3 millimeters is the sizing or the space between the edge and your stitching. And once you've gone ahead and punched the holes and stitched, here is the finished product. Now this is not waxed, this is not prepped or anything. Now is the finished product. As you can see, it's looking really good. That top part is not perfectly straight, but you know what, it works fine. And I'm also a bit disappointed about the lining, which got a bit dirty during the sanding process, but hey, this is a French ID card, and as you can see, it's just a weird size. Now, I have hidden information there, obviously, but it's just a weird size and doesn't fit in most card holders, and this is why I built this. And yeah, hopefully you guys have also got things that you might need this kind of card holder for. In any case, it takes a huge amount of stuff, as you'll see in a few seconds. But yeah, there we go. So guys, feel free to let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this video. I'd always love to hear you guys and respond to you. In the meantime, you've got all the details of this in the description with the link to download the pattern. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you're new to the channel. This really helps me out even more than anything else. And thanks a ton for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed, hopefully you've learned something on the way, and I'll see you very soon for some more leathercraft.